Your muscle fibers have no way of knowing how heavy the weight in your hand is. Nothing inside the cell can weigh anything. The number stamped on a dumbbell stays out in the world, and the fiber doing the work never receives it. Yet on the surface of that very fiber sits a protein assembly that decides, set by set, whether your body builds new muscle or lets what you already have keep shrinking. Which is how a man who has lifted the weights he trusts 3 times a week for a decade can watch his arms grow slowly smaller, while a neighbor with a rubber band and no gym membership puts visible muscle back on at 70. That sounds impossible, and it stops sounding impossible once you learn what the fiber actually reads. You can feel the boundary where the reading happens. Every set that ends short of that boundary shares one signature. The last repetition feels the same as the first. Controlled, comfortable, familiar. You have finished years of sets exactly that way. What it was waiting for was something else entirely. It begins at a row of anchor bolts. Thousands of them stud the surface of every muscle fiber you own, mooring the cell to the connective tissue around it, fastening the machinery inside to the world outside. Pulled gently, a bolt holds its shape. Pulled with tension approaching what the fiber can bear, the bolt physically bends. The bending itself is the message. Biologists call these bolts integrins, and the bend they take under near-limit tension travels inward as a chemical order. Deep in the cell, that order reaches the master control for building new muscle protein, a switch with a laboratory name you can carry in one breath, mTOR. The switch works like a lock that takes 2 keys at once. One key is chemical, cut from the protein you eat. The other key is structural, cut only by tension near the fiber's limit. Turned alone, either key leaves the lock unmoved, and plenty of people in their 60s and beyond have spent years faithfully turning the chemical key by itself. What counts as near the limit, though, is a definition your body has been quietly revising for decades. That revision is why the load that built you at 40 stopped building you at 65, and the full story ends somewhere unexpected, at a boundary you can reach with nothing heavier than objects already in your house. Everything runs downstream from the bolt, so the bolt is where the story starts. An integrin is a strand of protein threaded straight through the fiber's outer membrane. Its outer end grips the collagen scaffolding that wraps every fiber. Its inner end grips the cell's internal skeleton. The molecule is, quite literally, the joint between your muscle and the world, and like any joint under load, it deforms before anything fails. Along the fiber, the bolts are arranged with a machinist's regularity. They cluster in bands that repeat along the whole length of the fiber, riveting the contractile machinery to its sleeve at interval after interval, which turns the entire cell into one distributed strain gauge. A fiber under load is being read everywhere at once, along its full length, at every rivet line simultaneously. There is no single dial. The whole surface is the dial. That deformation is where force stops being force. Docked at the inner end of each bolt waits an enzyme, focal adhesion kinase, a name worth hearing once and then setting aside. Call it the messenger at the anchor. When the bolt bends, the messenger changes shape with it, switches on, and starts a relay of chemical signals that ends at the growth switch. Mechanical strain in, molecular instruction out. Engineers would recognize the arrangement as a transducer. Biology calls it mechanotransduction. And it is how a cell without ears or eyes reads the outside world through its own skin. The stairs you climbed this morning were read this way, step by step, along the rivet lines of your thighs. Physics buys the cell something chemistry alone could never afford: speed. A hormone drifting through tissue takes its time arriving. Tension travels through a taut structure, the way a tug travels down a rope. So the instant the load approaches the limit, every rivet line along the fiber feels it in the same breath. The reading is fast, it is honest, and it is local to nothing. Now the pathway also shows up in the plainest kind of measurement. Grown on a flexible sheet in a laboratory and stretched, muscle cells fire the messenger with no exercise involved and no nutrients added. Strain alone, applied hard enough, is a complete sentence in this language. Setting the trigger so high follows an engineering logic. Building muscle protein is among the most expensive projects a body can fund, and a cell that funded it in response to every stroll would bankrupt itself. So the trigger sits close to the edge of capacity, where the mechanics say the current structure was nearly insufficient for the job it was just asked to do. The fiber invests only when the evidence says it had to. It is insurance underwriting at the scale of a cell, no payout without proof of a near miss. And the premiums are real because muscle is torn down and rebuilt continuously, day and night, whether you train or sleep, so every gram the body agrees to carry commits it to a permanent maintenance bill. Every workout you have ever done arrived at your fibers in this currency, bends, and the absence of bends, force becomes chemistry at the bend. So why did a load that once bent the bolts fall silent? Because the muscle you built answered it. The load that stood near your limit in your 40s raised your capacity, and capacity is the yardstick the bolts measure against. When the load stays constant while the yardstick grows, the tension slides further from the edge with every month of faithful training. The bolts ride the load without bending. The messenger stays folded. The switch stays shut. Your own consistency turned the volume of the signal down. A ceiling of this kind waits above every repeated stimulus. A daily walk meets it after enough months, and a fixed pair of dumbbells meets it in exactly the way you have been living through. The body files whatever recurs unchanged under routine, and routine is precisely what this trigger was engineered to ignore. Here is the bookkeeping at its most unsentimental. Every session that made you stronger also made the next identical session quieter. Progress and silence were one event wearing two faces, and the set that felt smooth this morning felt smooth because at the level of the bolt, almost nothing happened. You have felt the filing take effect. The dumbbell that once finished you now finishes with you, still fresh, and the freshness reads as progress right up until the tape measure disagrees. Most responses to a plateau make the accounting worse. Faced with a stall, most people add volume, another session, another day, a longer workout. But a set that ends far from the limit registers at the bolt as silence, and repeated silence, however diligent, still sums to silence. 10 quiet sets deliver what one quiet set delivers. The trigger counts proximity, and proximity is exactly the quantity that extra volume leaves untouched. Adaptation, though, accounts for only half of the stall. The other half happened inside the switch itself, on a schedule set by age rather than by training. What changes a lock that nobody touched? Somewhere past 50, the lock begins to stiffen, and both keyholes stiffen together. On the chemical side, a serving of protein that turned a younger lock with ease produces a fraction of the response late in life, so the meal that once sufficed now falls short of a raised asking price. On the structural side, the price climbs in parallel. Muscle protein synthesis after matched bouts of resistance exercise, measured across age groups, traces a blunted curve in older muscle, with identical mechanical input yielding a smaller anabolic answer, as Kumar and colleagues charted in the Journal of Physiology. Physiologists call the whole phenomenon anabolic resistance. Both keys still fit. Each one simply has to turn further before the tumblers move. None of this is guesswork read off the outside of a body. The blunted curve comes from small samples of muscle taken before and after exercise, with new protein assembly tracked molecule by molecule, so the stiffening of the lock is a measured quantity, visible in tissue, plotted against age. Held together, the two rises finish the arithmetic. The signal your training sent decades ago was calibrated against a younger threshold, and the threshold climbed while the signal stayed where your habits had set it. Inside a body, that arithmetic is quieter than it sounds in a laboratory. It means the gardening, the stairs, the weekend rounds that genuinely maintained you at 50 are sliding under a bar that has kept rising, and the muscle they once defended thins at a pace the effort itself keeps disguising. You can do everything you were ever told to do, keep every promise you made to your own health, and still watch your shirt sleeves fit more loosely each year. The advice you are keeping was priced for a lock that turned more easily. Effort feels like enough. The bar has moved above it. A stiffened lock also explains a cruelty you may have watched in someone you love, how fast an older body loses muscle to a hospital bed or a sedentary winter. Breakdown of muscle protein carries on regardless of age, while the building side now answers only a loud signal. When the signal disappears entirely, the ledger runs one direction at speed. A week of enforced stillness costs a 70-year-old tissue that a 30-year-old would barely miss, because only one of them has a lock this hard to turn. Which raises the only question that matters. If the threshold now stands higher, what actually clears it? For years, the assumed answer was simply more weight, and for a body past 60, that answer collides with its own joints. which is why so many people your age quietly concluded the game was over. Exercise physiologists sat with that deadlock too because the obvious experiment had a hole in it. Light and heavy had never competed on truly equal terms. Then the answer arrived from laboratories that set out to compare heavy against light. One group lifts near its maximum, around 80% of the most it can manage, for 6 or 8 repetitions. Another lifts light, 30 or 40%, for 25 or 30. Both continue to the point where the next clean repetition refuses to come. Measured weeks later by scans of the muscle itself, the two groups have grown almost indistinguishable amounts of tissue, a result Morton and colleagues demonstrated in the Journal of Applied Physiology and one that other laboratories have replicated since. A footnote travels with it: top-end strength, the single heaviest lift a person can manage, still favors training heavy because maximal strength is partly a skill of the nervous system. The size of the muscle, the tissue itself, grew alike. This calibration belongs to you. The equivalence was measured in younger adults. In older muscle where the lock stands stiffer, the direction holds, but the margin narrows. Lighter loads must run closer to genuine failure to match what heavier loads deliver. The asking price at the boundary climbs. 2 loads, 1 reading at the bolt. Set beside the anchor bolts, the equivalent stops being strange. The bolts report distance from the fiber's limit. A light band at genuine failure and a heavy bar at genuine failure both stand the identical distance from the limit, none. The bend is the bend, whatever produced it, and the messenger relays it without an opinion about the equipment. Genuine failure has a precise meaning worth keeping. It is the repetition where speed drains out of the movement and the next clean attempt will not come, however hard you ask. Stopping at discomfort, the place your sets have been ending, sits a long way short of it. Discomfort is an opinion. Failure is a measurement. So what makes those final repetitions different in kind from the first ones? Your nervous system staffs every effort the way a careful moving company staffs a job. Light work goes to the small, tireless crews first. Heavier demands call in bigger crews. And the biggest men on the payroll, the fast-twitch fibers physiologists label type 2, leave the truck only when everyone smaller is already spent. The order runs fixed from smallest to largest, a rule of recruitment the textbooks call the size principle. Follow a light set through that rule and you can watch the roster fill. The first dozen repetitions belong entirely to the small crews, which is why they feel like nothing. As those crews tire, waste chemistry pools in the working tissue and their force fades. The effort to move an unchanged band starts climbing, larger units switch in 1 rank at a time, and by the closing repetitions the band that weighed nothing has become, to your nervous system, a maximal event. The burn you have spent a lifetime avoiding is that pooling, arriving on schedule, announcing the changing of the roster. The workforce was the thing that changed. The load stayed exactly where it began. That signature from your own sets, the final repetition arriving as easily as the first, now has its explanation. The small crews handled the entire job. The big crews stayed on the truck, and the big crews are exactly the fibers age takes from you fastest, the ones that stand you up out of a chair, catch you when a curb surprises you, and break the seal on a jar. The strength that guards independence lives in units a comfortable set leaves asleep. Carried to failure, the picture inverts. The small crews empty. The nervous system calls the reserves down off the truck. And for those last attempts, the type 2 fibers, the rarest and most endangered ones you own, are finally under load. The shaking, the burning, the ugly slowing of those last attempts is the sound of a full roster working. It reads as the set going wrong, and it is the only part of the set the deepest fibers ever feel. One border softens the word failure. The final repetition itself carries most of the value, and the repetition or two just shy of it carries nearly as much, because the full roster is already working by then. What the bolt cannot forgive is the set that stops 5 comfortable repetitions early. Your last decade has been made of those. Well, the first time I understood that the fiber reads distance from its own limit, the final 2 repetitions of anything I lift became the part I refused to hurry. You now know what builds muscle after 60. Tension carried to the true boundary of what a fiber can hold, whatever object supplies it. The question changes here, from what the fiber reads to what happens inside it once the reading lands. The growth being ordered needs a workforce, and that workforce is what age has actually been raiding. A muscle fiber is one of the largest cells you own, a cable of contracting protein that can run several centimeters. No single command post could administer something that long, so the fiber carries hundreds of nuclei strung along its length, each one governing its own stretch of territory, issuing the blueprints for the protein inside its patch. Biologists call each patch a myonuclear domain. Picture a groundskeeper and the acreage he can honestly tend. Governing is daily work, because the maintenance bill from earlier never stops arriving. Contractile protein wears out and is replaced on a rolling schedule, and every replacement part is built from blueprints a nucleus must issue. A patch sitting near its groundskeeper gets serviced promptly. A patch at the far edge of an overstretched territory whites, and tissue that waits too long between services weakens before it thins. An estate grows only as fast as it can hire. Where do the new groundskeepers come from? They wait in plain sight. Satellite cells, stem cells parked in shallow dormancy on the outer surface of the fiber, between the membrane and the collagen wrap, stationed among the very anchor bolts that read the strain. Their address is the point of this story. The narrow space a satellite sleeps in changes shape whenever the fiber beneath it deforms, so a cell with no view of your workout is pressed awake by geometry, woken mechanically by the strain event the bolts are reporting. When that event arrives and keeps arriving across weeks, the satellites answer. They divide, and some of the daughters fuse into the fiber itself and donate their nuclei, new groundskeepers walking onto the estate. Fusion here is a one-way door. A daughter cell that joins the fiber gives up its separate existence for good, folding its future into a structure it will now spend that future maintaining. Hiring in this tissue is permanent commitment. Inside your arm at this moment are nuclei that walk through that door because of work you did decades ago, still at their posts, still issuing blueprints for a territory they adopted when your hair was another color. Each hire raises a hard administrative ceiling. A nucleus can only issue blueprints so fast, so the amount of protein a fiber can build and maintain is capped by how many nuclei it holds. Growth beyond a modest range waits on the workforce. The signal orders the building, and the hiring makes the building possible. Age moves against this system twice. The pool of satellites thins across the decades, and the survivors wake more reluctantly, needing a louder and more repeated signal before they stir. Among older adults put through months of resistance training, the ones who added measurable muscle were the ones whose satellite pools expanded and switched on, as Petrella and colleagues counted in experimental gerontology. The workforce answers a sustained pattern of demand. In the studies where older pools switched on, the demand arrived a few times a week and kept arriving across months, a shape of persistence rather than a shape of heroics. A single ambitious Saturday reads as noise. A season of that tension reads as policy. Here the second key from the opening of this story rejoins the first. The hiring and the building that follow near-limit tension are construction projects, and construction consumes material. So the chemical key, the protein on your plate, matters most in the hours after the structural key has turned. A lock that stands stiff on an ordinary afternoon turns most willingly in the day after the bolts have bent, which is why the meal that follows a true session counts for more than that meal eaten on a quiet afternoon. The two keys were a sequence all along, and then, the shrinkage you can see in a mirror acquires its cellular translation. When the signal stays absent for years, groundskeepers retire without replacement. Each remaining nucleus is left holding more territory than it can supply, and the fiber balances the books the only way available to it, by surrendering territory until the estate matches the staff. The thinning of an arm is acreage being given up. Other lines sit in that account too. Protein synthesis slowing as the lock stiffens, motor neurons withdrawing from fibers they once commanded, hormonal tides turning across those decades. The estate is the line your own signal most directly rewrites. There is a hopeful ledger entry hiding in the same books. In animal models, nuclei gained during a period of training persisted after the muscle later shrank, and retraining rebuilt the size faster the second time. In people, the speed with which lost muscle returns points in that direction too, though the accounting is still argued. Read cautiously. It suggests the hiring you do in your 60s may stay on the payroll, waiting even through an interruption, so a bad winter or a bout of illness pauses the estate rather than dissolving it. Muscle appears to keep receipts. More than movement retires when the estate shrinks. Muscle is the largest clearinghouse your body has for blood sugar, because the freight doors that haul glucose out of the blood swing open in this tissue whenever it contracts. A fading muscle quietly narrows the main route your body uses to clear a meal. The blood sugar that lingers longer after lunch in your 60s is partly this, a clearinghouse losing floor space, and every estate the fibers surrender closes another loading bay. So the workforce needs the signal to arrive on schedule and to clear a raised bar every time, delivered by a body whose joints have opinions of their own about heavy iron. What produces near-limit tension without a rack of plates and without a gym membership? Bolt's answer to physics. And physics offers levers the plates on a barbell never mention. Lever 1 is time. A weight lowered over 4 slow seconds keeps the bolts bent for the entire descent, where that weight dropped in 1 second grants them a glimpse. Deformation is being integrated, the way a long photographic exposure gathers light. A snapshot misses total time under tension scales, the total mechanical stimulus reaching the switch. Lowering deserves its own sentence because the physics of lowering is stacked in your favor. A muscle resisting a load while lengthening produces more tension than the effort feels like it should, which means the lowering half of any movement is where a light object stands nearest a fiber's limit. Rushed descents throw away the cheapest tension of this kind available to a human body. On the evidence itself, one distinction matters: the equivalence of heavy and light loads at failure is measured and replicated. The slow descent dose curve is supported rather than settled, a real relationship whose exact curve is still being drawn. Lever 2 is arithmetic. Any object handled by one limb instead of two stands twice as close to that limb's capacity. So the suitcase, the watering can, the single-arm carry across your kitchen turn household mass into near-limit tension through nothing more than division. The house already holds everything required. It simply needs fewer hands on each object. Lever 3 is the pause. Every movement has a position where the load stands tallest, the lowest inch of a stand from a chair, the halfway point of a curl, the held hang of a shopping bag at the bottom of a straightened arm. A hold at that position is deformation, with the clock left running. The messenger keeps relaying for as long as the bend lasts. The arrangement asks for one thing only: strain near the limit, sustained, and a hold supplies that as fully as a lift does. Now assemble the 3 levers and the weight rack dissolves. A light band ridden down on a 4-second descent, paused where it fights hardest, and continued until no clean repetition remains has delivered the same reading. A heavy fast set produces at that boundary. The band, the body weight squat to a slow count, the loaded carry of full shopping bags, the bolts register strain and distance from limit, and rubber, iron, and groceries are all fluent in that language. The joints, meanwhile, notice the difference the fibers cannot. Aging tendons and cartilage tolerate a light object moved slowly far more gracefully than a heavy one moved fast. So the version of this that spares the shoulders happens to be the version unchanged anyway. You will recognize the moment the signal lands, because the signature from all those years of comfortable sets finally inverts. The last repetition arrives feeling entirely unlike the first, slower, heavier in the hand, honest. That difference is the bend happening, and it is the one part of a session worth trusting over any number written on the equipment. Of course, one caveat belongs beside all of it. Sets pushed all the way to failure raise blood pressure while they last. They ask real questions of joints and tendons too. Anyone carrying a heart condition, unmanaged blood pressure, or a recent surgery has a physician who belongs in this conversation before the first slow set does. One calendar is worth knowing in advance, because it protects you from quitting at the wrong moment. The first weeks of new strength come mostly from the nervous system learning better routes to the fibers it already owns. Coordination arriving before construction. The tissue itself answers on the slower schedule of hiring and building, across months in millimeters. An older body on this program is doing everything right long before a mirror agrees, and the bolts have been bending the whole time. Every session ends at a boundary. Every boundary is a message. What did all the comfortable years actually say? They said, in the only language the fiber speaks, that no near miss ever occurred, that the current structure was ample and could safely be reduced. The body believed every word, because the bolts did their job without error. They reported exactly the distance they were given. Somewhere in your house tonight sits an object light enough to be overlooked and heavy enough, carried slowly to the honest end of what your muscle can do, to bend the bolts, wake the messenger, turn the structural key, and set the groundskeepers hiring. The bar that stalled in your hands for a decade did everything except visit the boundary the fiber measures from. The band that worked ended every session at that boundary with nothing left to give. The weight was the vehicle. The deformation was the message. The message was always what mattered.